Welcome back to the podcast. Today I am talking to Ben Billups. Ben is the founder of Noble and has been in performance marketing for nearly a decade and has 6 startups under his belt and is a 2-time founder. His work spanning e-commerce, edtech, and news media has culminated into a unique strategic perspective that combines the efficiency of guerrilla marketing with the robust outcomes of enterprise solutions. Now, Ben is building a world-class team in email marketing, specializing in e-commerce strategies, newsletter growth, and audience sourcing. And he is on a mission to elevate the global quality of life by enabling brands to reach the right people at the right time with the right information. Ben, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
Dude, so there's so much that we can dive into, from running the agency to doubling your business to niching down. I want to first start with the premise. Why newsletters? Email is like the cockroach of the internet. Like, it's always been here and it's never going to go away. I feel like newsletters have always been a thing. Like, newsletters is not new, but it's making a trend or an uprising in the marketplace. I'm seeing it primarily with B2B information and or services. So I'm curious to get your take of why did you lean into email, and what are some of the things that you're seeing exciting within the scope of newsletters, because it's like making a comeback.
Yeah, 100%. I can't say exactly I agree with the connotation that it's a cockroach. If anything, I think it's the golden darling child of the internet. But I understand what you're saying. And to some extent, yes, you're like, it never goes away. And people have been saying for a decade and a half at this point, they're like, oh, that's the old way of doing things. It's dead. But in reality, and you could pull up these charts. If you look at a chart of just global revenue from email marketing, it is a straight linear growth curve over the course of 2 decades. Like, it only goes up, that's rare for anything. And especially for it to be that way for so long. Like, there isn't even a dip in the growth curve. It's just like email marketing revenue just goes up and up and up. And so that's part of the reason why we niched out into it, is because it's an extremely high ROI channel that almost any brand can benefit from focusing on. Speaking to the B2B newsletter space, or even newsletters in general, are like very hot. Creator newsletters, whether you're doing sponsorship, services, software, whatever that is. There's a couple of things that are happening all at the same time. There was a swing, even in the consumer marketing space, there was a swing back to newsletter, or not to newsletter, but really just like email marketing popularity, especially with the iOS 14 update that impacted advertising tremendously about 3 years ago at this point. And then you have things like the TikTok ban. What's happening a lot with any time these platforms change their algorithm, or there's a change in regulations that impacts using these platforms, the way that I look at it is there's 2 categories of marketing. One is rented audiences and the other one is owned audiences. And rented audiences that's if you're doing Amazon FBA, Meta, TikTok, whatever that is. And that's where it's on a platform that you don't have control over your ability to reach that audience. That being said, obviously they could be reliable and highly profitable for extended periods of time. So it's not like it's a waste of time, but you just have to understand the fact that from a business perspective, you don't fully control what's happening in that channel. And if tomorrow Instagram says, actually, we don't want external links in our reels, or whatever it is, and that could dramatically impact your business depending on how you have things set up. And that's not a decision that you get to make or have input on. On the other hand, you have owned audiences, which email marketing is one of a few different types of owned audiences. But the reason why owned audiences are so powerful is because, generally speaking, and this is not 100% true, but generally speaking, the bigger your email list is, the greater your revenue opportunity from that email list is. You have contact information of either potential customers or past customers directly within your ICP. And you can monetize that in a variety of different ways, including using that to inform, like doing things like building lookalike audiences in Meta, et cetera. And so we put a ton of emphasis, and we approach it from a philosophical level, very much thinking in terms of this is first party data that's an asset within the business. So there's multiple outcomes there as well. There's businesses where they actually get more valuation when they sell the business because of the sheer amount of data that they own. There's also businesses where they file for bankruptcy, and the data that they own is part of the assets that's in the sell-off, right? And so building that, it's legitimately an asset within your business. It's data. Collecting that, keeping it up to date, et cetera, has a ton of value. Speaking to newsletters specifically, I think there are some similar reasons why there's been a swing back to newsletters. One is that, especially in the B2B space, especially if you go like B2B SaaS, there was like this rage for a while with cold email outbound. So people building these systems to send direct response messages to people who probably don't even know who you are and just sending them offers or trying to get them on a call. And that still works. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but especially in the SaaS space, it got very saturated because if it's you and three other vendors and you're all competing for the same 100 companies on this Fortune 500 list or whatever it is that are in your ICP, that gets saturated very quickly. And so SaaS companies, I think, were the canary in the coal mine where they just started to see diminishing returns in terms of their investment versus what they were able to get out of a marketing effort like that. And so there's that. And then I think just emphasis on owned audiences in general, it's picked up in popularity because there's a lot of email platforms, there's a lot of educators who have been just raising a lot of awareness with like how much money you can make with sponsorships and with list rentals and how much like services you can sell. And so especially the B2B space where, and really I think of B2B as like most B2B is 5-figure plus deal value, right? 5-figure, and it's not uncommon even in services and SaaS for that to be 6-figure plus deal value.
Yeah.
And so the idea that you could have someone on your email list and be building rapport with them before they even take action on any of your lead magnets or hop on a call or anything, that just started to gain a lot of popularity. And that's what we're doing a lot of list building for our clients right now. It's very easy math. If it costs you anywhere from $1 to $5 to collect a single email subscriber, and then you land one deal a quarter from your newsletter, then it's like very easy math. It's wildly profitable, right?
Yeah.
So in the B2B space, it just started picking up a lot of steam because a good way to think about it, and this is just true of marketing in general, right? A lot of people have heard of the rule of seven, which is this idea that a prospect or somebody within your potential audience has to see something from you roughly 7 times before they're going to take action. And you could make a pretty good case that a newsletter is actually the number one most cost efficient way to hit 7 to 15 touch points within your ICP in a fairly short period of time. And so that even just goes back to like your frequency, right? So like the clients that send, and obviously there's a lot of variables in there in terms of like how you're collecting your audience, how exact it is, how good your content is, et cetera. There's a lot that goes into it, but there's a ton of marketing that goes into just getting in front of the right people consistently in a cost efficient way. And I think there's just been this growing awareness around it, which is what's led to this kind of boom, or I guess you could even say like rebirth of newsletters in the last like year or so.
Yeah, I've been seeing that trend primarily on Twitter, which is definitely related to SaaS and B2B SaaS, which makes a lot of sense how it's expanding. I appreciate your insights. And from someone who does, I see your videos almost every day on LinkedIn, so I know this is going to be a really good conversation. A few things on that note where it is an inbound play, it is an authority play. I think one of the other key aspects too, like you mentioned the shared, like you don't own the out, like you're just renting that out from, and people gamify algorithms because they change every single quarter, sometimes every month. But the interesting point there is that because I came from the direct response advertising underground world, like we would, like you name it, we probably sold it. There's like interest groups, so you can target specific interests based on, oh, this person's demographics. They probably read HubSpot, or they're like, those are interests, but you're renting it based on the platform that the algorithm gives you based on data points that they collect. The interesting part with the newsletter, it's almost like an owned interest group because you know exactly what they're going to like. So in another way, it's another way to target, but then you actually own the quality of that newsletter. This one of the things that you mentioned too is if I do a drip sequence inbound with my lead magnet, that's not the same as a newsletter because the ethos of a newsletter, from my understanding, please correct me if I'm wrong, it's you're coming from a place of generosity and or authority, either taking one of the 4 personas, right? You're an authority in the space, teaching down what you've learned from the high heavens. You're a leader who is like exploring unknown territory, uncharted territory, or you're just a reporter talking about what's happening, tech news or updates or whatever, or you're just selling or like ideas or thought leadership. Oh, you downloaded this thing with behind a pay, like an opt-in page or a paywall, and then you drip them with 7 or 9 emails over the course of 14 days, assuming that's going to transition to a sale. I think the newsletter has to come from a place of give, add value, build relationship, and then from there it transitions to sales conversations. How are you seeing and how are you strategizing around what I just mentioned, like lead mags versus just like newsletters, and how, because they're almost the same, but they're also different in a way.
Yeah, the right approach really just comes down to the specifics of the business, right? Some businesses just know that 80, 90% of the people who are going to buy in a 2-week window. And so they're just super aggressive in that 2-week window. And then after that, they don't do much. There's still money in the list after that period. That being said, I think especially in B2B, because the price point tends to be much higher, you tend to be competing with a fewer number of vendors for value or services or software that commands a higher price. taking the opportunity to build rapport over time with someone is
Mm.
worth it. And it's part of this full ecosystem. So it's very typical with the way that you'll see someone approach marketing on LinkedIn or Twitter, where the thought process is, I'm getting my profile in your feed every day, right? You see my videos go by, you start to build an impression of who I am, what I do, what I know, etc. And newsletters operate in a similar universe. The one thing that's particularly easy with newsletters too, though, to your point, is you're basically collecting these top of funnel intent signals. To give you a good example, one of our clients, he basically consults for other agencies in operations. And so what he'll do, we do a bunch of different like warm outreach enablement for him. So we do the core list building, but then we also help him scope out who clicked on my Calendly link and then didn't book a call, right? Or who
Mm.
clicked on this specific video and we have some idea that they probably at least watch some of it. And if we reach out to them, they're going to be more receptive to it than if this was just pure cold outreach or if we were just leveraging this email list to send direct response messaging. And so you can layer in all types of different strategies, and it really just depends business to business, like what the best stack of strategies and tactics are. But the typical baseline, to your point, the newsletter is value added content that's designed to get engagement and is also designed to collect intent signals. So it's we can see if you've opened 7 newsletters in the last 30 days, you're probably pretty interested in what we're doing, right? Versus if you opened one. That gives us a signal, right? We can also layer direct response on top of that. You could take segments of your contacts that are like hyper engaged and you could just be pushing them straight sales offers and you'll get good results from that. And they're unlikely to unsubscribe because they've been engaging with your content so much, right? So there's a lot of ways to slice and dice it, but having that newsletter at kind of that core, because that's where you're generating the information to then keep pulling prospects further down the funnel.
Yeah, the way that one of the follow-up questions, you answered it there, but I was going to think, how do you differentiate newsletter versus CRM? Because the CRM is engaging and following up with people who are high intent, especially in the B2B context. The newsletter can just seem like it's noise, but then from there you're picking up the signals, and then from there you're moving them into like reach out to them to offer an opportunity to jump on a call, maybe it's a discovery session or whatever, and then that's how they move to the CRM. How are you interplaying with that? Is it the same system for newsletters and CRM, or are you separating them?
So it's typically separate systems. Sometimes it's combined. If you're using a platform like ActiveCampaign, for example, that's a full featured platform in the sense that you can very easily support a newsletter and a full CRM all within under one roof, which can be good. But from a cost efficiency perspective, we have a lot of clients where maybe they're using Beehive for their newsletter, for example, which is a very inexpensive newsletter platform. And then we're just helping them integrate that with HubSpot or whatever it is that they use. And again, you can slice it up a lot of different ways. Sometimes you can create some kind of definition for a hyper engager and then sync that to their CRM to be flagging for warm outreach. It's here's their phone number. You should probably give them a call, right? That's one way to do it. But then also you just have your traditional magnets where it's if you have an ebook or a free consultation or whatever it is that gets them to that next step of the funnel, you can obviously be pushing that to your newsletter audience. And then as soon as anyone takes action there, they're in your CRM. It's pretty straightforward.
To move them from one location to the other. Let's switch the tables here. You talked about early before in the pre-record, niching down, not niching down. Tell me the arguments to not niche down right now, why you're on the fence.
So just for context, we do both consumer and B2B services right
Yeah.
now. My background is in e-com. I started going down the email rabbit hole in the e-commerce space, specifically larger beauty brands. It's something that personally I just really enjoy. It's fun to send an email. Oh, we just made $30,000. That's pretty cool. Also, the volume of data is pretty addicting too, especially when you're dealing with bigger brands that have lots of traffic or lots of email addresses. Sometimes you can run a split test and you hit statistical significance in 24 hours. That's a rush of blood to the head where you're like, oh yeah. And then you just keep iterating and you're very quickly figuring out and optimizing those marketing efforts. And we still work with various e-commerce brands, but we're seeing a lot of traction in the B2B space. I think a lot of it is just coming from that wave of interest in newsletters. We're working with some software companies, PR companies, et cetera. A lot of these brands are thinking, you know what, we need a newsletter. And then they're coming to us for that list building component. We're just seeing a lot of traction there right now. And at the end of the day, we've grown purely through referral and inbound for over 2 years now. And a big part of the reason why that is because we have really great fulfillment. And so the thought process with niching down is just, we're in the middle of considering, can we reliably fulfill on both verticals, or should we really zero in on the B2B side and just make sure we're doing the best that we possibly can? In terms of, I can come up with about as many reasons to niche down as to not. A lot of smart people are telling me to niche down, and I accept the advice. I don't really disagree with any of the points. I think for us, the goal is for Noble to become a holding company that has within it a media brand, a data brokerage, a service business, and a software product as well. So the long term, that 5 to 10 year roadmap is a pretty big vision. There is a part of me that wants to make sure that we're keeping tabs on what's the latest and what's the best in different verticals, because it's likely that eventually we will be serving all those verticals very well. Short term, though, it is easier to say, okay, like I know if we just say we only do this newsletter growth service and maybe a little bit of content or whatever it is, it's easier for us to build systems around that and to scale that from like a team perspective and everything, because we know exactly what we're looking for in terms of quality and execution and like KPIs and everything, versus on the e-com side. And another thing that frankly is like difficult in e-commerce is just that the business itself is frankly like a bigger variable. So like in B2B, it's usually a lot simpler and it's a lot easier to justify different marketing efforts, because like attribution can be hard. B2B attribution is like notoriously difficult, but because the deal value is so large and like the ICP is usually like pretty specific. Right now we're talking to a company that sells, it's literally like a software add-on to Microsoft 365. They only want like the CTOs who work at companies with at least 1,000 employees and use Microsoft 365. And that's so specific that we know we can succeed when we go find that audience for them. Versus like in e-commerce, there's frankly just a lot more complications with the business in general, where maybe they have like good site traffic, or maybe they have a decent sized email list, but operationally they're not ready to grow. And it's okay. There's been brands I've talked to where they were in the multi 7 figures, and just like listening to them talk about the business, I'm like, yeah, there's a big opportunity for you in email, but I'm not even sure if this is a top 5 problem for you, because the bottom line is just that the consumer space is just much more complicated. So sometimes a lot of it, in my view, comes down to client selection as well, where we know we can deliver disproportionate value as long as a brand meets a minimum standard. But then there's just a lot of other variables that can impact success from internally within the business itself that can complicate being a good service provider in that context, if that makes sense.
Have you considered also creating your own IP and processes unique to each vertical? Like when you just select and pinpoint one, you can go real deep and just create new innovations there. Is that part of the mix here when you're thinking?
For sure. Yeah. And we have stronger IP on the B2B side. So long story short, we basically developed a proprietary list growth process for news publishers. And then we flipped that out into B2B. And that's how we doubled our business so quickly, was that we basically, our core offer on the B2B side, or really like any newsletter that has high ticket sales attached to it, is that we can scale anyone's email list for 75 cents an email with an exact audience match. And that's something we can deliver for almost anyone that runs a good newsletter. And so that IP is what's driving a lot of traction for us right now. And then the innovation there really just comes down to becoming better and better at sales enablement, and then becoming better and better at our data sourcing as well. Where do we find these audiences, and what audiences do we have access to? So one of the projects that I'm super excited about right now is we're actually getting pretty close to having a fully developed social media, like email address append tool, where we can take anyone's LinkedIn following, we can take Facebook groups, we can take Instagram, we can take Twitter, and then basically we can build audiences and then also enrich that data to say, okay, you have 500,000 followers. Here's how many of those followers like actually are in your ICP, and here's their email addresses. Things like that are very meaningful in the B2B space. In the e-commerce space, I do consider us to be one of the better agencies around. There's obviously a lot more competition just in e-commerce in general in terms of being a service provider. But honestly, I think a lot of our success in e-com comes from our overall mindset and know-how, which can be harder to differentiate because it's not like a stack of case studies I could show anybody about how we crush in e-com. But sometimes it can be harder to describe because we place so much emphasis, for example, on list growth when a lot of vendors don't. You're going to generate a lot more revenue in a 6 to 12 month period with us than you will with another vendor. That's a fact. But that's not necessarily like IP. It's more so that our approach is so zeroed in on what's going to drive leverage for an e-commerce business that we just see better results than other vendors do. But it's not IP yet, in the sense that it's not like nobody else has figured this out or there's 0 other people in this space, versus like in B2B, I've been in this space for a little while now and I haven't come across anybody who does what we do. So that's part of why it's so easy to sell. I'm not a great salesman, We just have something no one else has, and that makes it very easy to sell.
That's the key thing. Even when I work with companies and they're offering the same thing everyone else is, we find that unique thing that no one else offers. And then when you sell that, it's a brand new product. And you mentioned that you had a volunteering experience that helped you shape how you view fulfillment. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, I think for me, like a lot of the early days of the agency, it was a typical progression for anyone who runs an agency where I was working at a bunch of different startups. Like I was in-house guy at all these brands. And then eventually, like my network just started sending more work my way. So I just started taking work on the side. I had a full-time job and I was freelancing. Eventually, there was enough business coming my way that it made sense to go full-time on the agency. And I think a lot of that, but those are referrals. Like those referrals that I would get came from people that I met and worked with over the course of like nearly a decade, right?
Yeah.
And that just came from doing the best job that I possibly could at each stage. And I even tracked that all the way back to things that I did in high school where I would work on, like I would do sound at church and things like that. And I just had great mentors who would basically, they showed me what it looked like to do something with excellence, how to be hyper conscientious with what you're doing, and also how to anticipate needs, which I think as a
Hmm.
service provider is one of the number one differentiators, which is, and again, I think a lot of principles that you learn in different niches are they're multidisciplinary, right? A
Mhm.
lot of things that you learn in one space can cross over into another if you abstract it to a high enough.
Yeah, it's principle based.
Exactly. And I think one of those things is just anticipating what's needed. So it's not just being aware of, it's not just following a process or like doing what's in my job description, but also understanding, okay, we've just done this. What's the next thing that we need? Or what's a potential problem that could happen that hasn't happened yet? But then how can we even stop that problem before it happens? And what I realized is just over time, the people would stick with us. Like I've had clients that signed with us day one who are still with us, right? And a big part of that is just because we care a lot about our clients and we're so on top of what's going on with each client. That's what's driven a lot of the strength in our fulfillment. And I track a lot of that back to just experiences that I had working with great mentors, working in areas that seem unrelated, but it basically taught me how to do things with excellence and how to serve the people around me in a way that's strong and that they appreciate. Ultimately, that could be hard to sell in the top end, right? Anybody will tell
Yeah.
you like, "Oh yeah, we sell amazing services." But really what that drives is it drives retention because once they're working with you, they realize they're like, "Oh yeah, this guy
Then there it is.
cares and he's exactly."
How do you operationalize it? How do you take a concept like that and operationalize it to the ethos of how you run the shop and how the people that you hire execute?
Yeah. That's basically been my number one focus for almost a year now, which has been, and there's a lot of things that go into it, but I think a lot of it comes down to just like your team culture, right? So making sure that you're imparting that level of dedication to your team is important. Making sure that you do have good processes and not just processes that say, here are the 10 steps to execute this task, but also here are the like 8 things you need to think about and troubleshoot for if you like see something that looks maybe out of line or just different, right? And like
Mhm.
things that are worthy of investigation. Building that type of thinking into your processes is really helpful. And then outside of that, really, I think the job of any great founder who's trying to scale, like the real skill is recruiting. It's finding the right people. And if you have the right people, the right processes, and you have good culture, you're guaranteed to succeed in some ways.
Your risk of failure goes down with the right hire. No, I appreciate that. And that is like the ethos of what started this pod is like, how do you take out that? I call it the inner beauty behind struggle, like behind trying to achieve that. And how do you live that out? So this is cool to have you personify that for us. One of the things that you've brought up in getting this podcast booked is a unique way of your mind, like how you approach thinking and decision making. Can you walk us through your mental model or your mindset framework?
For sure. I think looking back in like high school and college, I was very much perfectionist, which in some ways benefited me, but in other ways it held me back. Like in the sense that you have to develop a really good sense of how much does something matter and how good does it need to be. And
Mhm.
also, you can't look at every problem as the same. Not every problem is DEFCON 1. I think 1 is the biggest one and then 5 is the lowest. So you have to understand like how big are the problems, and then you can prioritize them, and then you can focus on the right things and build leverage. The two big concepts that have really helped me, one is that I've read a lot of Nicholas Nassim Taleb's books, so like Anti-Fragile, Fooled by Randomness, etc. I
Mm.
highly recommend a lot of his books, especially Anti-Fragile and Black Swan, because one of the big concepts that I pulled from him was just this idea that the overwhelming majority of mistakes are non-fatal, right? So you
Hmm.
think about fatal for your business, fatal for your relationship, apply that to whatever context you want. But the overwhelming majority of mistakes that you can make aren't going to be final. And so that really helped free me of the perfectionist mindset where not everything has to be perfect all the time. It's more about understanding which problems do I really want to avoid, and then which problems are actually just going to increase the speed of iteration, which basically gets us to the second concept, which is OODA loops. So it's OODA, observe, orient, decide, and act. It's a concept that actually came from the Air Force. And basically, it was an observation that was made by Air Force trainers where they realized it wasn't the pilot who hesitated to make the best decision, which would be basically perfectionism embodied, right? But it was actually the pilot that made the first decision that usually ended up succeeding in an exchange. The thought process behind OODA loops is you make an observation, you orient based on that observation, you make a decision and you take action. When you're following that process, you're thinking about it explicitly as you're doing it. Effectively, what you're doing is you're by taking action, you're generating the information that you need to make your next decision. And
Yeah.
that next decision might be to backtrack, right? You might be like, that was actually the wrong decision. We should go back to what we were doing before. But the faster that you make that decision, the faster you generate that information. And then the faster that you can actually improve what you're doing overall. Or should we do that? It's just move in the direction that you think you should move. And very quickly, you'll find out like, is the market responding to this? Or clients reacting well to this? Yes or no? We're in a really good position right now where we're iterating very quickly on what are basically like how good our services are, how we source audiences, how we build them, et cetera. The top line is that we have almost zero churn, which to me says overall, everything's working phenomenally well. We're looking for those signals to say, like, okay, if we source an audience this way and then we activate them this way, does that mean that this client actually gets more sales? Does it mean that they have better email performance KPIs? And then we just keep iterating based on those feedback loops. And so I think a lot of at least our success has really come from that type of thinking. And even like approach to what we're doing now in B2B was basically an accident where I was doing a lot of e-com and I was working with some big publishers, right? It's like news companies. And the development of our process that we use now for growing clients in the B2B space, it came out of a strategy that we developed that was basically a client requirement from a publisher where they were like, this is cool. We have this giant email list of people who should be reading our newsletter. Can we figure out how to reach out to them in a way that's safe and effective? And so we engineered a process specifically to them. But even at that, I did that like a year before I even started selling this service.
Hmm.
And it didn't even occur to me that this had a massive application in B2B. It took me almost an embarrassingly long time. And then the other part of the progression was then I heard someone at a conference basically say, oh, the best way to get clients is to have a newsletter. And then he started diving into all these lead generation strategies. And I was listening to him thinking like, oh, I was like, I can build a list way easier and way more affordably than that. And so I actually created an e-commerce newsletter to get e-commerce clients. And then in the middle of building that list, I was like, why don't I sell what I'm doing right now? Because nobody else does the thing that I'm doing. And
Hmm.
then that's when our business exploded. But it was just, again, it just goes back to like OODA loops, where it's like I was just making the best next decision and then making observations based on that and then making another decision. This B2B thing is probably like shiny object syndrome. And I'm like, okay, like I accept the feedback. And then we doubled our business almost by accident selling this thing that I had been sitting on for a year. And then now I'm thinking maybe the e-com stuff is the shiny object and maybe this is all I should be doing because it's working so well. And so I think it is really hard to pinpoint what's the right decision, but we've made so much progress in the last year or so just because I've always just focused on what's working, can it work better, and then what's not working as well, and do we even need to be doing that anymore?
No, and I think that two key points there on the first one, like the anti-fragility, that not everything is an issue. That draws back to me when I used to take vacations with the team, and I would tell them, unless you're on fire or a client is physically on fire, like legitimately there's fire on them, like you're not calling me. Because they're the same idea. There are very few things that could be such a huge issue where either you're going to figure it out on your own or we'll solve a bigger issue when I'm back. So I love that approach. And the OODA loops, I heard a dude, this guy, he's a air pilot. He's a jet fighter, and he had like somehow lost control of his thing. He had 5 seconds to make a decision because if not, he would crash and die. And yeah, you got to make a decision in 3 seconds and then make the action within that 5.3 seconds. If not, you're going to die. Obviously, that's a life or death situation. But here, we're in front of the screen all day. We're making decisions that we don't physically feel or see. The other thing too in the information age is that we have so much to think through, so much to discern, so much to like mentally work through, that we think that's the work. And I like this approach of the OODA loops is that just make a freaking choice, but take action. And then from there, make that other choice. And that's an iterative approach where you're saying that you fell forward into accidentally doing this thing, when in reality it was a chain of decisions and actions that are based on your intellect and discernment, as well as the environment telling you this is the right decision or not. It feels like an accident, but in reality you were just leading up based on your best decision at that point. So that is a huge takeaway here, because there's so much about how to decide what's the best thing, how to validate your idea, how to do an MVP. Like there's no other way. Just go out, sell it, or see what happens. You have to face that quote unquote potential for failure. But in reality, going to the other point, there may not be such a thing as failure at that point. It's just a feedback loop. I love it. Ben, for our listeners out there, where's the best place for them to thank you for being on and to learn more about what you're up to?
I'm very active on Twitter and LinkedIn, so you can just punch my name in there. I'll pop right up, posting every day. So feel free to message me. My DM should be open. So yeah, happy to chat. All things email marketing there. And then if anyone here is listening, you have a newsletter or you're interested in a newsletter and maybe you're interested in scaling that, you can go to forwardnewsletters.com, which is just fwdnewsletters.com, to learn more about what we do there.
Sweet. Ben, thanks for being on.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you'd like to get more of these podcasts, please go ahead and subscribe to wherever you're watching or listening to the pod. If you have any suggestions or questions that you want me to answer on the pod, or you have a guest that you want me to interview, please go ahead and email me all of your suggestions and questions at podcast@dogoodwork.io. That's podcast@dogoodwork.io. If you'd like to give me public feedback, you can go on Apple Podcasts, and from there you can leave up to a 5-star review. I would greatly appreciate that. If you like more free resources where you can get my best strategies to help you increase your company's performance and scale profitably, you can get handpicked articles to propel your growth, and you can get trainings and discussions that I give freely online, as well as low-cost resources such as my books and guides, you can get all of that by going to dogoodwork.io/free-growth-resources. 90% of all of these resources are not behind any email opt-ins. You can get instant access by going to dogoodwork.io/free-growth-resources. Now, if you'd like to accelerate your progress and shorten the gap between information and action and start seeing results in your business, let's work together to increase your company's performance and scale profitably and serve more clients without the overwhelm. You can request a free clarity call to see how we can best support you to reach your goals by going to dogoodwork.io/apply. Again, that's dogoodwork.io/apply. As always, it's an honor to be a small part in your journey. This is Raul Hernandez. Do good work.